microphone on. I'm here in Berlin. I've been at the Ascribe offices for about half the week. Did an intensive kind of a presentation and then discussion with Trent McConaughey and his team, and then did a deep dive with their architects to see, where there are possible points of collaboration. So quite excited about that. I think it was there was a lot of interest, and there's a lot of it's a good timing from the point of view that they're kind of doing an architectural review, planning for their next phase of or the next iteration. So it was very fruitful in that way. I think there might be some practical ways that we can help each other out. I'd love to see the RChain node with the sort of the 2.0 version of the big chain DB underneath as a data source. So that could be quite interesting. Also, I met with Clément Epier, who is at the focal point of a very interesting group in Paris that brings together startups and research groups and sort of the incumbent industry to do a practical collaboration and explore new ideas. He just had one of his projects was a blockchain energy project called Daisy that just came back from doing some field work to try to explore the feasibility of doing blockchain energy projects in the developing world. So I'm quite interested in that. I'm very interested in making sure that RChain is vigorously pursuing all avenues with respect to blockchain and decentralized energy solutions. So that was very exciting. There are 3 points where we are looking to collaborate, and one of the most important is that he needs artifacts from RChain to begin to socialize the ideas of RChain, which is why it's such great news that and Kent wanted me to pass this along. So we now have the full ERC20 token contract compiling in Rolang and executing on top of the Rosette VM. So this is a major milestone, and that's been checked in. In addition, it looks like Kent and Navneet and Glenn did some work and got a rolang.org site up and running. So it's not quite a REPL, it's still very nascent work, but this is exciting because we're at a point now where we have a little web-based experience where developers can come and type in Rolang code and have it evaluate and see what the results are. So that is ongoing work. It's still very rough around the edges, but I'm excited to see it come into being. So this is really great. Additionally, I've been pursuing with Pyrofex the idea of sort of taking on board the development of development tools and develop an IDE and relations with the incumbent IDEs, and there's sort of been some positive response around that. So more to come on that as the ideas develop. But my aim is, however and whoever takes it on. My aim is that as soon as Mercury is out the door, right on the heels of Mercury, we have a bunch of developer tools for Rolang and for RChain in general. So this is part of the plan, and we're very, very excited to get this underway as soon as possible. Also, since I've been here in Berlin, I met with Tim and we went over a few questions about the parser. And Tim also joined the conversation with Clement. And I thought that was really important because we want to make sure that, you know, everybody, you know, has a chance to everybody understands kind of the bigger picture, the larger goal, or goals, and you know, kind of knows how their pieces fit into the efforts that we're doing. So it was really good to meet with Tim. Is Tim on the call?
Yes.
Hey, you want to say a few?
I just sent you an email regarding further parser questions, and besides, yeah, it was nice meeting you. It was a good talk.
Oh, good, very good. Yeah. It was also interesting. I think Tim had a really nice attitude. He couldn't quite make BNFC work for some of the Rosette parser stuff, so he went down the path of using Antler and was able to get something going. And I think that's kind of the way we need to be, not necessarily wedded to any one platform, as long as we get the stuff done. So I was very excited to see that. And then finally, I've started to sketch out a kind of a framework for testing Casper, which has been one of my goals, to make sure that we have, you know, something that's, you know, a simple test, and yet compelling and worthwhile building a simple kind of test framework that begins to not only test just the code, but also test some of the implications. And I'll go through those ideas a little bit later. But I wanted to pass the baton over to Ed and see if he has any updates on the holding side and just any updates in general.
Hey, hi Greg, hi everyone. Yeah, we've had a number of investor conversations that are interesting. You know, one guy I met with this morning here at the Navneet and I met at the Redmond office. He literally heard about us at an airport. Someone was talking to him about blockchain and RChain, and he lives in the Seattle area and was so excited and wanted to meet us. He heard about, in particular, the safe, and so he came in, and just an awesome conversation. So like now RChain is an airport conversation.
Woohoo!
So it's really interesting.
We passed the security gate.
Yeah, exactly. Last Thursday, Lisa and I met with a sort of a private investment / business network group here in the Seattle area as well. I was invited by this group because they wanted to understand about blockchain, and you know, this was a diverse group. They were folks ranging from an executive at a local bank to insurance brokers, and there was an M&A guy. There was an attorney who's working on a token sale for a Seattle area business. And so it's quite an interesting conversation, just walking through all the misperceptions that people have about blockchains. And so that was a very great education session. And then after that, met with this M&A guy for an hour talking about RChain, and it was great getting his initial impressions and so forth. Two in particular that we can talk more about at some later time was he had concerns about the supply of staking tokens and the governance around that supply and use of the staking token. So Greg and I talked yesterday morning some about that, how we can make that more clear on the co-op side, and then also make some decisions, board level decisions, as opposed to individual decisions, and that will help give investors confidence, such as this guy who's considering an investment in the holding company. So anyway, that was an awesome experience and conversation. as Greg mentioned last week, the co-op is preparing for a private sale of rocks, and we've retained 2 advisors that are associated with David Otto, and met with them and are continuing to work through sort of materials that are needed to better understand the cooperative and the opportunity in front of us all. Greg's planning on writing a white paper to help that effort. These advisors and us will write a business summary that'll include a financial forecast, especially from the expense side. And then also I'm going to take another pass at the architecture document, just because I haven't looked at it since like January, and so understanding and so forth has changed. We'll have a working session later this week on this business summary as well. Also, I've been talking to and with Nathan about our marketing and brand image. Is Nathan on? Okay, so he's not on. Our intention is to write a branding document about, you know, what, and this will help also with the investor pitches. You know, what are the primary, you know, ethos and messages that we want to change as RChain from convey as RChain cooperative, and what kinds of feelings do we want to stir up in our messaging on marketing, and then that will lead to a discussion around the logo for the REV token, and maybe the ROC token if we choose to have a separate logo for that. I'm expecting Nathan will drive a lot of this discussion, and it'll be with a lot of input from the community. I was hoping he'd be here to discuss that, but first I'd like him to have this conversation around branding. So we started some discussions there too. I think that's all I have.
Sweet. No, thank you very much. That was really good. Also, Jim Weiscarver had some interesting comments regarding some of the stuff that I discussed, and I wanted to make a couple of clarifying points. So recently, and I want to keep harping on this, what I have said is that if the Casper algorithm works as we expect it to, and I have every confidence that it does, then one of the things that we'll be able to do is to replicate arbitrary rewrite systems. You know, whether your rewrite system is JavaScript or what have you. And what this does is commoditize the platform. That doesn't mean that it makes the platform not matter. The platform still matters, but what it will do is to greatly highlight, adumbrate, and make clear that differences in the computational models. So in particular, if you have like you should be able to replicate regular expressions, but are regular expressions going to be, you know, the kind of computational model that fits this domain? No, they aren't, and they clearly aren't. And anyone who gives it, you know, 2 seconds worth of thought will recognize that regular expressions are not well suited to this domain. But you can still use the replication algorithm, the consensus algorithm, to replicate a regular expression execution across a bunch of decentralized nodes. So, you know, and there might even be value in that, but it's not going to be it's not going to meet a lot of the demands that we've been talking about or that have emerged as people consider the space. Likewise, any sequential model, by comparison to a model that is inherently concurrent, right? Replicating those different kinds of computational models will make the features of the computational models very, very starkly clear. And that's what I was saying. So the commoditization of the platform means that a lot of what has gone into the capital requirements and operational requirements goes away, which means the the platform choices with respect to computational power, computational fit for the domain, all of those will come to the forefront. And some of these other considerations will go to the back. And that's what I meant when I talked about the commoditization of the platform. So a lot of the value in the platform, the sort of the heavy duty operational and capitalization costs will no longer be justified because you can press a button and get it done. However, the differences in choices, design choices around things like whether you're using something that is fundamentally concurrent versus something that is fundamentally sequential, those will come to the fore. And that's where healthy competition and cooperation will really begin to ferret out the best choices, the best design choices. So I really appreciate Jim for sort of highlighting that conversation.
Yeah, I was taking it a slightly different direction. I guess I was in the context of using something like React as a value key store.
Yep, that's an excellent choice. Absolutely. You can use any of a number of different key value stores. React is a perfectly reasonable choice from a number of different perspectives.
And I was thinking about like their search applications. I was thinking that, that a Rolang program is sort of a search application on top of React. It seemed like
it's possible. Somebody.
We lost you, Greg.
I'm still here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Okay, great. I absolutely agree. We should have lots of different realizations of RChain nodes on different kinds of stores. And we'll sort of, post Mercury, we'll lay out a roadmap for different kinds of storage and a plug and play architecture for different kinds of storage. But up to Mercury, we'll be focusing on one storage choice. Unless there are any other major updates that we want to give, I'd like to talk a little bit about this test framework and also this whole idea of beginning to grow a test organization that interfaces nicely with the community, because we really will rely heavily upon the community for being able to to hold our feet to the fire and make sure that we have the right quality bar. So that also, and I've organized the discussion here in a way that it sort of has this practical side, which is, a real test of consensus. And then the other side is that it tests the ideas of consensus and what this means, what the implications are. What does decentralization mean in terms of the existing infrastructure, the existing compute and services infrastructure. And I want to lead the idea, lead off the discussion with the following, recounting or recognition of certain kinds of experience. I think everybody is familiar with the experience of the conversation between the individual agent, such as, yourself or myself, trying to talk to an organizational agent like a bank or a hospital or a government service. And we know what that experience can be like. It's like you call into a line. There's a phone tree a phone menu that's about 20 levels deep, and at the end of that one is connected to another person, and that person is not empowered to take appropriate action, nor are they actually informed of any of the information that was supplied in the 20 level deep phone menu. And so there's a recapitulation of the information, and then there's the navigation of the human organizational tree in order to get to someone who is actually empowered to help with a question or make a decision or something like that. So this is a very common experience. And the slides I'm going to present challenge that's the way it has to be. And I'm going to say why that's important, sort of the social context for why that's important as a part of this discussion. So again, I'm attempting to work on multiple levels all at once here. So I'm screen sharing now, and let me bring up the slides. Hang on a second. So this is a draft, and this draft will also, a lot of the ideas and concepts of this draft will find their way into the white paper. I apologize that OmniGraffle has changed the way they do page layout, and so the presentation of the slides, the look and feel is not as pretty as it has been. So kind of, as I said before, there's several desiderata here. So first we want to provide a kind of compelling test of the consensus algorithm. And the second is to illustrate the nature of different kinds of agency, right? And, you know, the interesting point is that different levels and different kinds of agency actually can have, as opposed to what we often experience in the world, they can have fruitful and even satisfying engagement and interaction. So the individual talking to the organization can be a completely different experience with a consensus algorithm. And that's one of the ways in which consensus has the potential to completely change a modern society. So I'm going to suggest that we build an organizational agency that can act as a single agent, that this is in fact what consensus provides. It makes it possible to have an organization, so a bunch of clients acting as a single agent. And in this case, I'm going to suggest that we make it, since we're trying to build a test that we can write code to, make this single agent one that plays a game. Gamification is a theme that runs throughout a lot of the work that I do, largely because we learn best when we play. But so here, what we're talking about is a community of agents that act as a single agent, playing as a player in a game. And I'm going to restrict attention just to two-person games just for now, like chess or Go. And the important point is that the organizational agency can be an aggregated AI, or it can literally be a community of human agents who act as a single agent. And that's sort of the point that I was making at the outset of this discussion. And this has implications for AI, and you know what has become a real. There's a lot of hoopla and hype around deep learning, and I'm going to make some proposals that suggest that we can do better than what is currently thought of as deep learning, and that consensus plays an important part in that, right? And this is all within the context of just building a test to test Casper. So the idea is that we want to take, say, white player in a game of chess. And it's made up of a community of client proposers and a network of validators. And then the community is subdivided into little sub-communities. So here's a little picture. And the thought is that each sub-community is proposing moves for only one piece, right? So you can imagine that you've got a bunch of clients that are moving one of the white pawns, and another bunch of clients that are moving another of the white pawns, and a bunch of clients that are only interested in moving the white rook, right? And so they're each proposing moves for that one piece. And those proposals are headed into Casper, which is going to create a consensus around one move, the one move. So here again, here's a picture that to reiterate this. So you've got a bunch of clients, and there's a single pawn, and there are a bunch of possible moves for this pawn. All right. Now, one would be just to advance forward 1. Another would be to advance forward 2, and another might be to take a piece on the adjacent square. And each of the clients is potentially proposing a single transaction for that pawn resource. Now, similarly for the knight, each of the clients is proposing a single transaction which mutates the resource, which is the knight. Right? And now, intriguingly, if we restrict the block size to exactly 1, this guarantees that the validators will pick a single move from all the client requests. And what that does is it allows the players to alternate moves. So white player can move, and then black player can move, and then white player can move, and then black player can move. And what you're getting now is a dialogue between organizational agency and singular or individual agency under the assumption that black player is an individual agent. And that assumption is actually worth looking into, which, and I'll get to that in a moment. But clearly, if the consensus algorithm performs in such a way that black player, if it's a human being, doesn't get bored or time out waiting for white player, then you have an algorithm that's responsive. It's responsive on the level that we kind of want to see consensus being responsive. Actually, we want to see it massively more responsive, but this is kind of a first cut at the level of responsiveness that we want to see. And more intriguingly, if we stipulate that the black player is a single agency rather than an organizational agency, then black player may be interested in whether or not white player actually is an organizational agency, or if it's a bunch of bots that are controlled by one entity, right? And so black player can actually demand a proof of consensus. And at least in a number of the proposals that have come back and forth between Vlad and I, we have such a proof. And the proof is a trace, or it's a set of sequences of justified messages that gives rise to the consensus decision. So whenever if any of you have watched the Casper Hangouts, when Vlad has run his simulations for the ideal adversary, the message flows that reach the consensus decision, that's exactly the proof of consensus. And that's what white player can provide if it is an organizational player. Now, it becomes computationally expensive and economically expensive to fake this, because every validator will be staked, and they would have to. So you would have the validators and their stakes, and all the clients, and all of the transactions that were associated with the production of the consensus. So that's both the computational cost and the economic cost to fake that consensus. So it becomes prohibitively expensive to fake proof of consensus. So this is a fairly reliable way by which black player can ask that a white player is actually an organizational agent. Now, it also has a separate role or a separate meaning, which is that it stands as an explanation of the decision. So the set of messages that go back and forth essentially provides a justification for the consensus, which is a justification for the decision. And therefore, so you can think about this. So the consensus is very, very much like the kind of flow you might see in a neural net, except that the flow here corresponds to an explanation, a justification. So unlike a neural net, if this were a bunch of AIs that were reaching consensus, this AI, the organizational AI, can actually explain its move. So that's quite intriguing when you compare it to deep learning. And in fact, the whole architecture as an architecture for AI is very similar to the shift in robotics that happened, I don't know, in the late 80s, early 90s, at least with respect to motor control, where the intelligence, like in hexapods, rather than having a lot of intelligence in the central control, the intelligence was moved out to the legs, and this was then picked up by a bunch of toy companies. I think I can't remember the names of the toy companies right now, and they're not paying me to advertise them, so I won't. But I think people probably are aware of this because these kinds of results have been out for about 20 or more years. But when the shift happened, where the intelligence was decentralized out to the legs, then for a wide class of robots, what we saw was a much more robust motor control. So that's and what we're suggesting here is we're moving the intelligence out to just the pieces, right? There's a sort of little mini intelligence in each pawn, or driving each pawn. There's a little mini intelligence driving the queen or the bishop or the knight, and consensus is what glues them together to act as a single player, and that's kind of the approach here. And notice that if white player cannot provide such a proof, then black player is justified in assuming that white player is really a singular agent, right? Everything else is just a sock puppet, and that has import for how we engage entities on the internet, which I think there's been a lot of discussion and debate around that. Now, notice that in the RChain setting, as opposed to other settings, we can nest these subcommunities. So it's perfectly reasonable that a particular set of clients that are only interested in a single pawn live in their own namespace. And then because of the way the RChain works, you can aggregate these up into a larger or more inclusive namespace for the consensus across the total set of client proposals that then roll up into a single move. And then there's some other niceties about this. You can think about piece removal in playing the game as one of two different outcomes. When a piece is removed, it can either be a validator is cashing out or unbonding from the protocol, or it can be a network failure. And in fact, if a pawn makes it all the way, if another pawn makes it all the way to the end of the board and brings another piece back, then that could be seen as a validator cash out. As a network failure. And otherwise, if the piece never comes back on the board, that was validator cash out. So there's some niceties about the fit between the test approach and some of the features that of Casper that we're trying to test. Additionally, when we look at other games, for example, the game of Go, there's more to this story. Specifically, when we in the game of Go, unlike the game of chess, new pieces are being placed on the board, and that corresponds to validator bonding. So testing the validator bonding, at least in this way of factoring the architecture. So that has some additional benefit when we think about this just from the point of view of testing Casper. One interesting point is that this doesn't do look ahead, right? So white player as an organizational player, there's nothing in this approach that does any look ahead in terms of the gameplay. So it's quite likely to be a lousy chess player, but I'm interested to see how bad it is. And I would leave that to future iterations. Also note that different stake distributions will lead to different player strategies. So if the queen is heavily staked, right, then queen moves end up winning more frequently, unless there's some kind of collaboration amongst say the knights or the knights and the bishops or things like that. So in that case, you'll get a different profile than, let's say, if the rooks were more heavily staked or the king was more heavily staked. So the distribution of stakes will result in different gameplays against the opponent. And I just kind of, one of the things that's fun about these kinds of tests is I'm trying to gamify and make it fun to look at lots of variations. Because if we do look at lots of variations, then we're going to end up testing, getting more coverage of the Casper algorithm. And then kind of the important point with respect to the implications of consensus for society is that we can begin to contemplate fruitful interaction between singular agency like a bear searching for honey, such as produced by an organizational agency like a beehive. Obviously nature is full of this. Nature is full of predators co-evolving with herd-like prey. And it's interesting to look at Homo sapiens as kind of balanced between being a social animal, but also working with singular agency as well. In fact, that sort of picks out human beings and Homo sapiens as one of the more intriguing species because it's dual in this way. It's both singular and social, and kind of what I think is going to be very important is that this class of consensus algorithms is going to make it possible for a lot of the creatures in the internet to take advantage of both modes of agency. So that's kind of the rough outline of the idea or the proposal. And I'll stop there and open the floor for discussion. Were people able to follow that?
Yeah, that's really cool, Greg. I have a question, at least initially, when you said that, say, 3 clients that are responsible for proposing moves, possible for one piece, are all responsible for submitting that move for consensus, and each will be a transaction. So how is one move chosen?
So since they're competing, right? Only one of them gets to be chosen, right? And the others are effectively bad bets, right? So over time, the whole group has to converge to one of those moves because that's the block size is exactly 1. So there's only one transaction amongst all the transactions proposed for the pawn, which is also being thrown into the pot against all the transactions proposed for a knight, all the transactions proposed for the queen, etc. Right? So they're all the validators are engaged in the Casper betting process to select exactly one of all those proposals.
Right.
And
so potentially you could say if I wanted to outfit the say the consensus protocol with a certain logic that specified or constrained moves to an optimal move, right? Because in chess we want to win. Then I could, possibly constrain whatever transactions or proposals that I was getting to fit within the constraints with which we define our optimal move.
Yeah. Yes. And in point of fact, you're foreshadowing the next level of development that I've wanted to kind of keep in my back pocket, which is when we utilize RChain's version of a Casper, where we have formulae that describe what goes in the block. you can now use the formulae to describe, information about a gameplay strategy.
Right.
I don't want to open that door yet.
Sure,
I'm trying to keep that curtain closed just for a minute. But you're and this is exactly what I'm hoping to for people to pick up on. So you're on the money as usual. So, very good.
You're blowing my mind again, Greg, but I'm still not completely clear on who's doing the betting.
Oh, so the betting is done by the validators. Let me go back to screen share.
And and they want to win the game. They want to get
No. The validators are completely unaware of the game of chess. They have no clue that chess is being played. Only, and in fact, there's no agent here that sees that there's a game of chess being played.
Right. So in this schema, they reach consensus on a random move, essentially.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, it's not actually random because the validators are staked.
Right. I mean, that doesn't make it any less cool. That's still I think an awesome way to think about it.
Right. Exactly. And so what you can do is then you can make it less random, and how you make it less random is actually quite intriguing.
Right, like
staking the queen higher. That's tweaking the game.
That's tweaking the game, and that's what I said. The staking distributions changes the player profile, but that's not sufficient, right? It's not sufficient, and pulling your queen out first against certain kinds of opponents is not going to be a good idea, right? So there's more to this than just favoring the move of one kind of piece versus another. There has to be a way to encode more of the intelligence of the whole, and that's kind of the next step. But I just want to get people used to the idea that there is no entity here that has a global view of the game.
Right. So it's like I mean, on kind of an intuitive level, it's like the pieces are playing the game rather than the person behind them.
That's correct. The pieces are playing the game, and that's why I was trying to say that this is remarkably like the move in robotics. So the legs don't know that there's an ant, right? The legs don't know that there's a goal-seeking behavior by the ants. The legs are just trying to be legs, but they're smart enough to be fairly good legs, and that makes that kind of decentralized intelligence, at least for it was a major shift in robotics. And actually, I was talking to Vlad about this, and he was asking for references. And where I found out about this was in Kevin Kelly's book, Out of Control, which I read in the early 90s. And I heartily recommend it to anyone who's interested in decentralization. Kevin Kelly was way, way, way ahead of the curve on this. And so I really think people, I don't mind, promoting that book because it's worth reading. It really talks about the shift that the blockchain, I think, is very much a part of, which is decentralization, push the intelligence out to the leaves, more autonomy, and effectively, it's a funny relationship to trust, because what you end up doing is you're trusting your peers rather than trusting in some overarching control that governs all the peers. So that's I'll shut up now.
So if we could define in Roland what it means to win a game of chess, could we use that for staking?
I didn't hear you, Jim. You cut out. Can you repeat?
So I'm sorry. So if you could write in Rolang, define what it means to win a game of chess, could that be applied to staking moves?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can do anything you want. In a Turing complete language, you can do anything you want. The important point here is to not bend Casper out of shape, right? That's really that's the critical thing. Is like, you don't want the validators to know that they're playing a game of chess, right? You want the validators to only be concerned with consensus. So all of the intelligence about playing chess has to be pushed out to the leaves. Although, as I said, just by having this one constraint, which is the block size is 1, that forces the alternating move thing. So there's lots of different degrees of freedom here that one can tweak in order to make this organizational entity more intelligent and a better player. But I again, kind of the important point here is that it's not that we, as we try to make this a better chess player, we don't lose the fact that the validators are just giving consensus. So one thing that you could do, for example, is that you could make the pawn or the clients that move the pawn around more aware of the whole game, right? So, for example, if there was human agency behind each of these clients as opposed to AI, then the humans could all be looking at the chessboard, right? And so, now they know that they only can move their pawn. And so if they think that their pawn's move is a good one, they'll propose. If they don't, they'll be quiet, right? And that's kind of how this might change if you had greater intelligence at the client side. But that's again, I'm just trying to be suggestive here. I think that the most important point is beginning to understand that that organizational intelligence can emerge out of very, very restricted moves, very, very small things. I mean, one of the places where this landed absolutely, I mean, made it crystal clear in my body that this was the case, was when I went and studied West African drumming in Africa. Any one part in a sub-art piece is easy. I mean, it's very, very simple. The village idiot like myself can play it. And yet, when you put all the pieces together, the complexity of the conversation is what makes the song satisfying and compelling. And that's what I'm trying to suggest is going on here. But it's also the fact that any participant is getting feedback from the whole. That makes this begin to work, and that's kind of like what I was suggesting before. That the players that are behind a particular pawn, if they had a certain kind of intelligence or agency, they could be looking at the whole board. The players who are playing sabar in a sabar orchestra, they can hear the whole song. And they know how a subtle variation in their very simple part will either bring out a conversation or subdue a conversation or provide some kind of nuance to the whole piece. So that's it's a different kind of thinking about organizational intelligence. That I believe, goes back to the origins of our species, that we've always understood this and we kind of keep forgetting it.
Johann Gevers gives a great talk It's called The 4 Pillars of Decentralization, where essentially he argues as to, why the current hierarchy that exists between, or that exists in our society, kind of the patriarchal, political landscape that is, that's how humans organize ourselves now. And it's essentially that in the early part of mankind, that we existed in small kind of decentralized nomadic tribes and such. And, in that time, everything was mostly decentralized. So it was pretty easy to get consensus on an entire group. But, as kind of our population grew, say if we fast forward to Rome, and the size that Rome was, it became technologically essentially impossible to get consensus on such a large group of people. We just didn't have the tech for it. So a hierarchy was essentially the only way that we knew how to scale our societies. That is, like, you only answer to one person above you, and you don't pay attention to what essentially what's outside of your scope, which kind of, he argues, led the way for certain individuals to claim that the hierarchy was broken, and then for people to vote to replace the hierarchy. And hence, we see essentially that, any modern election is always about change, right? And it's because it's a time-old tradition to say that the hierarchy is broken. But I think it's interesting now that we're finally at a point kind of where we have the technology that is enabling, or that would have first enabled the same decentralized nature that existed in the early course of mankind. So it's called The 4 Pillars of Decentralization. It's a pretty good talk.
Cool. I'll definitely check that out. Absolutely. And I think, bringing it all the way back around to how I began the conversation, whether I'm talking about West African drumming or I'm talking about 2-person games, the thing that I'm trying to convey, to get across, is this critical understanding that the dialogue between individual and organization, between the one and the many, can be many times more satisfying and enjoyable. It doesn't have to be this mind-numbingly frustrating or spirit-crushingly frustrating experience. An organization can be responsive and playful and engaging, right? And we know this, like that's why people go to see music, right? When we go to see a rock band or we go to see a jazz band and we see the players having fun, and out of that fun and joy, comes this fantastic music, right? That's what we want to see. We see that there's a right way to be an organizational intelligence and to participate in organizational intelligence, where by right I mean joyful and productive and having a purpose. And the sort of to put the final point on this. This is the kind of organizational intelligence that we have to face the oncoming changes. So if we want to be able to respond effectively to climate change, we have to have a fundamental shift in the nature and quality of our organizational intelligence. And that's why the consensus work is so salient and so necessary at this point. And so again, I try to bring this all together. I'm just talking about a test framework for Casper that we can literally code up together, right? But once we have that test framework, I believe that people's eyes will be open as to the implications of what decentralization and the blockchain technology means in terms of the existing communications and governance infrastructure.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the black player can ask for a proof of consensus, which is going to be a sequence of justified messages. is it correct that the sequence of justified messages would constitute an explanation of how the one move was chosen out of the many moves?
That's correct.
And we've deferred. Okay.
It's not just a single sequence, it's a set of sequences.
Sure. And we've kind of deferred discussion in this document of how the choosing happens.
That's correct. Because that discussion has been ongoing for the last 2 years. Effectively, it's a form of bet, right? So each block is proposed, and the validators participate in a betting cycle on the proposals for the blocks. And as a validator sees new proposals, those proposals have to be justified, and there are conditions on when proposals are kind of in good faith versus when proposals are clearly in bad faith. Effectively, those proposals which have the same justification but propose two different moves. In this setting, it would be two different moves, same justification. That's equivocation. And equivocation is always considered in bad faith and is always slashed. And then the requirement is that the validators must gossip amongst each other, which then basically causes a reveal on equivocation. And once you have a reveal on equivocation, that's when you can be assured that slashing will take place, because it's in everyone's economic interest to slash someone who is equivocating, or a validator that's equivocating. So that's the rough sketch of how the choice happens.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Cool. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Thanks, Greg. That was awesome.
Oh, well, thank you. No, it's great to be able to chat about this. I really want to. Who was that?
That was Nathan. I thought you were gonna. It was like I have a dream. But not all the civil rights, of course.
Well, if we're going to be inspired by anyone, taking inspiration from Martin Luther King is that's one of the best sources of inspiration one could possibly have. So, cool. Thank you. Well, I fully intend to put a bounty program around this. Of course, the first thing I'll do to follow governance is to make sure that I make a proposal to the board and get feedback from the board. And assuming that the board is cool with that, I would like to put together a bounty program that goes out on the heels of having committed the Casper contracts to GitHub to begin the development of the test framework. And that's where I really, really want to have the community as much as possible involved in the development of that test framework, which is why I think a bounty program is like a first step in doing that. So that's kind of all I got for this week. I'm gonna jump off because it's already 9 o'clock here. But please, you guys stay on if there's more to talk about. Ciao for now.
Take care, guys.